Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
We have an interesting situation here in Michigan involving term limits. Term limits. And this was a hot topic a couple decades ago because we amended our Constitution here in the state of Michigan and basically said that legislators in Lansing are term limited and can only be in their office for so long. And then they can change to a different office, but then they're limited there as well. And the same is, of course, true like with the president. So term limits aren't unheard of. But some legislators who are now term limited out of office are suing, asking a federal judge to order the state to allow them to run, despite the fact that the term limits are enshrined in the Michigan state constitution. And the funny part is this has been tried before and shot down before. So, I guess you just keep trying, right? Beth LeBlanc wrote the story for the Detroit News. Former lawmakers' appeal case seeking to overturn term limits. 10 former lawmakers have asked a federal judge in the appellate court to hold that Michigan's term limits are unconstitutional by the U.S. Constitution because they're part of the Michigan Constitution. So they can't be unconstitutional in Michigan. They are, by definition, constitutional. So this is a decades-old voter-approved portion of the Michigan State Constitution. So back in 1992, this was put on the ballot. They actually asked voters, do you want to term limit the politicians in Lansing? Overwhelmingly, people said yes. It was passed by almost 60% approval rating on the polls. By the way, if you want to look it up, it's in the Michigan Constitution, Article 4, Section 54. Approved by voters in 1992, Michigan's term limits are considered some of the strictest in the country. They limit state lawmakers to serving a total of 14 years in the two legislative chambers. They can do 3 two-year terms in the House and 2 four-year terms in the Senate. And after they're done with those, they're done. Now, in the appeal filed in April, the lawmakers asked the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals to consider their case in light of U.S. Supreme Court rulings on candidates' rights to be on the ballot. Their argument is different now from the one that failed in 1998. And so the 1998 case and the precedent it created was one of the main reasons that the recent case was dismissed. So these lawmakers filed the lawsuit and it got dismissed in January. So they've now appealed it and they're asking the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals to overturn that lower court ruling. If the court were to overturn it, it would not prohibit Michigan from adopting any term limit proposals going forward, the appeal said. Instead, the injunction will open the door to a meaningful conversation about how term limits have and have not worked in Michigan and the adoption of a valid term limits regime, one that is more in line with what other states have adopted. So let's just stop here for a second and consider this. In 1992, 60% of the people who voted said we want term limits put into our Constitution, and our Constitution allows for it to be amended that way. So it's put in the Constitution. Here we are, almost 30 years later, and some former lawmakers have gotten together. They're term limited out. They filed a lawsuit and they said they simply want to have a meaningful conversation about how term limits aren't working. Again, 30 years later, 10 former lawmakers want to have a meaningful conversation about how it's not working. The obvious solution here is if this ain't working, amend the Constitution again and remove it. And there's a process for doing that. It's the same process by which they did it. So these 10 guys could get together. I don't know, there might be gals involved too. But these 10 people, yeah, there's a gal in there. These 10 people need to get together and start gathering petition signatures to amend our Constitution. If they think that this is something we need to have a meaningful conversation on going forward. The East Lansing economist who wrote the 1992 term limit constitutional amendment called the appeal pathetic and encouraged lawmakers to start collecting signatures if they wanted to change the term limit law. And yeah, if you don't like the law, change it. And what's ironic about this, I have a channel on YouTube. I often speak into this thing, record what's going on, and post it on YouTube. I often tell people, if you don't like the laws, there's ways to change them. You go to Lansing, if that's the state you're in, Michigan, or you go to Washington, if you want national law, federal law, And what you do then is there's a process for either changing a law or passing a law or repealing a law. Now, this shouldn't be news to former lawmakers who are term limited out, because these people have spent 14 years working in Lansing. They should know how this works. And how this should work is you don't like the law, repeal it. And since it's a constitutional amendment, you have to amend the Constitution, like it was done in 1992. So here come these legislators who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and want a judge to overturn it, he said. Where is the outrage at these legislators trying to overturn the 1992 election? If they want to change the Constitution, they can do it right away. Go get signatures. Meanwhile, these lawmakers filed their suit in 2019, arguing that term limits violate constitutional rights such as equal ballot access and freedom of association. They're actually saying that they should have the right to go into Lansing and associate with other lawmakers as lawmakers, except that they can't because they're term limited out. They also argued that the 1992 rules decreased institutional knowledge among lawmakers and increased the influence of lobbyists who had been working in state policy longer. The limits are a disincentive for lawmakers to develop long-term plans or working relationships across the aisle, the lawmakers argued. And those arguments have some merit. But this was all hashed out in 1992. And the voters decided that those were not powerful enough arguments to overcome the ones that simply is we don't want professional politicians who just get entrenched in Lansing and just are up there feeding at the trough. And that's what most people think of when they think of somebody who's been in, the legislature for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And that used to happen. And so the argument is that if you don't let people stay in office, they'll become lobbyists. So I find this fascinating. The 10 former politicians here are in essence threatening, if you don't let us do this, we'll become lobbyists. The funny thing is, there's a simple solution for that. They could pass laws on controlling lobbyists. They could, but they don't want to do that either, because that's plan B for every legislator at the state capitol. So the thinking is, you can get yourself elected, stay in office as long as you can. The moment you get kicked out of office for whatever reason, you become a lobbyist. So I find that to be what we consider just kind of a weak argument that, if you don't let us stay in office longer, we'll become lobbyists. That's what you're going to do either way, right? That's what you do. So the former state rep who made a statement on this the other day said, the reality is Michigan's term limits have created a dangerous level of learning on the job, highlighted by the pandemic. As Michigan has struggled through the pandemic, I can't help but wonder what it would have been like if the legislature had stronger, longer-term relationships with each other and with the governor. U.S. District Judge Janet Neff dismissed those arguments in January, ruling that they were without merit and citing the precedent set by the 1998 case. Plaintiffs offer no basis on which this court may properly disregard the clear and binding precedent in the 1998 case that also upheld Michigan's term limits. At the time of the judge's ruling, the Attorney General, who represented the Secretary of State, who was named in the suit, welcomed the decision and said any term limit changes should be approved by voters. Michigan voters took action 3 decades ago to change our state constitution, and that amendment has now held up twice in a court of law. So of the 10 lawmakers who'd signed onto this lawsuit, all but one of them were barred from running again by term limits. So, I remember at the time that this happened, 1992, there was a spirited debate in the public about whether or not term limits are a good thing or a bad thing. And I've heard arguments from both sides. And there is no right or wrong answer. There isn't. Like I said, the president is term limited. Okay? There's a constitutional amendment that limits how many times the president can be elected. And that we know about that. And most people go, makes sense to me. And so there was a time when people in Michigan were getting fed up with what they thought was inaction in Lansing by politicians who didn't care about anything but getting reelected and just maintaining their position, role, whatever you want to call it, in Lansing, but they didn't seem to be responding to the needs of the people. And so they thought, well, one thing we can do is we can get rid of the career politicians by putting in term limits. And I liked the idea at the time. I still like it now. But I also think that as a matter of just following the rules, if a law gets passed and you don't like the law, well, go get the law changed. Constitution gets amended, you don't like the amendment, amend it back. There's a process for doing that. It's pretty straightforward. The reason they're doing it this way is because they know they can't do that. The term limits are popular. Okay, they're popular. But the other thing is, and this I will admit is simply my gut feeling. This is just me. So if you want to say, Steve, you're wrong on this, or I'm right, it doesn't matter. This is a gut feeling. I personally think that if you went back and found an opportunity to speak to our founding fathers, I understand it's not possible, but theoretically, and you got to sit down and talk to them. I'm talking about the people who drafted the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, or the Federalist Papers, or the various people who sat around and conceived our nation, who actually thought about what it was going to be and laid it all out and just, hoped it worked for the best. And they started it, and here we are today. If you asked them who they imagined would be in the legislature, passing the laws, spending the money, running the country, running the states, even the local legislatures, your town councils and so on, the various people that go do your work, because we don't all have time to go do all this stuff ourselves. That's why we have a system like we do, where we vote for people and they go and handle stuff for us. If you asked them, what kind of people do you want doing that job, and how do you perceive that job being? I doubt that any of them would have said, oh, we would like people to get into that job, entrench themselves, and become professional politicians, and turn it into a full-time job. And in fact, that's one of the things that I still have a problem with. Michigan has a full-time legislature. Not all states do, and not all states need them. And the problem, of course, is that the legislature basically runs itself in a lot of ways. And so when it comes to salaries, for instance, set by the legislature, and the perks they get, set by the legislature. And so I don't think, again, this is just my personal thing. I have a degree in history. I've studied a lot of this. But I personally think that if you were to summarize or just somehow describe what type of person the founding fathers wanted running the legislature, they'd say, just people from the community who care. People from the community who care. We want smart people. We want reasonable people. We want strong-willed people. We want people who are willing to do the job, who are smart enough to do the job. But do we want them there for 20, 30, 40 years? No. Why would they do that? I don't think they intended those positions to be filled by professional politicians. I think they expected it to be, here's a guy who's a farmer from this district, and he speaks pretty well about the district because there's a lot of farmers there. And then there's this woman here, and she ran a business back here, and so, a family business maybe. And so she's in the legislature right now, and she kind of looks out for her community, but also understands business. And these are people here who represent their communities, but they aren't just, we'll send a professional politician, and they'll send a professional politician. And I think that was what it was supposed to be like when it comes to just basic representative democracy. And so term limits were an attempt to get away from what it had become. And most people, I think, if you asked about this, would say, actually, I still like it. It's working. And so the fact that they found 10 people who don't like it in a state with a population in the millions indicates that you might be in a very, 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 very small minority of people. And generally speaking, the way things work, I get one vote. And I vote. I get one vote. And if you don't like the way things are here in Michigan, you get a vote. You get a vote. You get a vote. We all get a vote. We all get a vote. So here are 10 people who should each get one vote. But they want more than that. So they're suing to overturn term limits specifically so that they can run again for offices which they've been term limited out of. At least 9 out of 10 of them have been term limited out. And the big threat is that if you don't allow this, they might become lobbyists. Oh, boy. So Beth LeBlanc wrote it for the Detroit News, and I hope the Sixth Circuit throws this one out as well. But former lawmakers appeal case seeking to overturn term limits in Michigan. We'll see what happens. I will update you. Questions or comments? Put them below. Those will talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. I drank some boiling water because I wanted to whistle.